is Ray McMurray, a writer, New York City, close enough. And he's going to talk about in modern culture. Paine is supposed, it's called Why Isn't Thomas Paine Cool? And this will be involved today.
Okay. So first of all, thank you to everyone who made this weekend possible. Special thanks to Gary. Also to Roderick Bradford, who's the editor of The Truth Seeker, and he's also on the board. So, okay. Why isn't Thomas Paine cool? It's a pretty lame title, I know, but I think it's still a good question. Because we're all gathered here to celebrate Thomas Paine, and you know, my question of why isn't Thomas Paine cool is really more of like a beard for examining a more important question, which is really like, what would it mean for our country if he was as valued and appreciated as some of his lesser contemporaries seem to be considered today. So let me just get this right out of the way and say that Thomas Paine is cool. And yes. But cool isn't something that you try to will into existence, right? It's very uncool. And there was a time in the United States of America, trademarked Thomas Paine, when that man was unquestionably the coolest guy around. But for some reason, his star has faded, and I think it's worth, well, especially in the context of this silly talk, I think it's worth going through an exercise to examine why Thomas Paine is in fact cool, perfectly clear. What do I mean by cool, which is a little trickier, everyone has their own definition. Why hasn't the general public picked up on this, even trickier? And what can we do about it, which is trickier still. So let's go back a little bit, talk about this guy, Thomas Paine. And I'm going to go through some of what are, to me, his like greatest hits. He started out, you know, on his own, picking up an education where he could, and when he did, he made the most of it. Paine eventually got a government job, and his peers started listening to what he had to say. So when the workers started organizing, they chose Paine to represent their case to Parliament. Parliament, you know, didn't really care very much, it seems, but there was a guy who did pay attention to him, and that man was American Benjamin Franklin, who actually was the coolest guy on the planet at the time. I don't know if anyone's been watching the television or listening to the radio recently, but there's an Elvis biopic that's out or is coming out or something, and like he was the Elvis, you know, in turn of the 18th century. And to extend that metaphor a little further, the founding fathers could be considered like all the great bands that came about afterwards. Although in this context, they were going against the British invasion. It's a joke for my boomer comrades. So, you know, Paine really impressed Franklin, and this is a guy who, when he discovered electricity, was like, I knew it, right? So, pretty tough audience. But, you know, he wrote for the masses, everybody says that. Stylistically, he feels so modern. It's, you know, what Lynn has been researching. But he was, you know, the original People's Champ, essentially. He wrote some great lines, including, I love the man that can smile in trouble. Right? It's like, sounds like a Leonard Cohen lyric or something. And Paine's debut, as everybody knows, or in America, was Common Sense. Now, that book is just so cool. I mean, beyond the content, this call to action is a style of it, which is just like thumbs in your ears at King, just boldly stating what everyone is already feeling, but hadn't yet articulated outside of themselves. So style is cool. Paine had it in spades. Thomas Paine was a dangerous man. That's a cool thing, especially dangerous from the perspective of anyone with undue wealth or unearned privilege. His ideas are still dangerous to this day, which makes you think that his story is being suppressed by an establishment that's threatened really by his beliefs. Still, that alone should be enough to make him cool, but it's still a powerful expression. So when the revolution was over and the dangerous man was finally living in a land where he thought he no longer represented a threat, he decided to leave. He decided to go find revolutions elsewhere. Paine had an edge, as most cool guys do. And we have to admit, although we love him, he wasn't always easy to get along with, right? And he was reckless. I mean, there's the story of the first part of The Rights of Man coming out in England, and he hung around, right? Like knowing the reaction it would provoke, but he wanted to take part in the danger a little bit and to see what that crazy reaction would be. It's an overhead shot. Let's see, I think it was why is Thomas Paine cool? What do we mean by cool? Why is the general public pick on this? What can we do about it? There's another view of Paine. This is Paine as the dangerous man, still multi-talented Paine, right? So having escaped to France, he became a member of the National Assembly, and while debating the fate of deposing the king, he fought for Louis's life. He said, spare the man, kill the king. And this was at a time in Paris when somebody could get their head chopped off just by putting on airs, right? But he fought for this seemingly contrary objective, even though he knew it was the right thing to do. He shouldn't have killed the king. Now, ultimately, the dark turn that revolution took resulted in Paine, forced to survive on ground that was constantly shifting under his feet, even though his convictions stayed in place. Can I tell a joke?
Yes.
Okay. What do they call Thomas Paine in France? Do you know?
Thomas Paine.
That's true. They also call him Thomas Bread. Bread? I wrote that joke 3 months ago and I was like, don't tell it. Now we know why. Okay. So Paine eventually left Paris, overtaken now by the wrong kind of radicals and drenched in too much bad blood. The French are discussing the joke still. He's coming back to America and he finds that the country's being run by a bunch of hacks and capital cronies and the worst kind of company men. Chief among them is this guy, Alexander Hamilton. Nobody? Okay, allow me. Boo! Hiss! Boo hiss! This is, Alexander Hamilton is, he's probably the worst of the founding fathers, which is saying, this is a side-by-side of him with a great white shark. I don't know if there's a resemblance for anyone else who knows. But a lot has been made about Paine's criticism of George Washington when he returns to the U.S., including the famous line, treacherous in private friendship, but a hypocrite in public life, and a hypocrite in public life. But quite a bit of his vitriol was directed at the other lesser, but no less destructive Federalists of the day, John Adams, Buzz Aldrin of American presidents, and this guy, Hamilton. So, and it's a very funny thing, isn't it, right? Because I mentioned some of Paine's lesser contemporaries being appreciated today, but like, how did this, early America's proto-neocon snake worm his way into the public consciousness to become this kind of standard bearer for the American left? Like, how did that come apart, or how did that come about? While you know, Thomas Paine, year after year, remains essentially dateless on a Friday night. And I only want to rag on Hamilton as much as Paine did in his letters and published works once he returned to America. If you haven't read Letters to the Citizens of the United States, it's really worth it. It's his finest writing on government. It's a criticism of the way that the Federalists were running things. So, this is a sampler. But while I beheld with pleasure the dawn of liberty rising in Europe, I saw with great regret the luster of it fading in America. In less than 2 years from the time of my departure, some distant symptoms painfully suggested the idea that the principles of the revolution were expiring on the soil that produced them, which is a commentary on the way that Hamilton was running things. So, we talked about Paine's greatest hits, so let's talk about Hamilton's a little bit. Following the revolution, he thought that Washington should have declared himself king. He thought senators should be appointed for life, which kind of is how it is today now, a little bit. I mean, unfortunately, show of hands if you're voting for Chuck Schumer. Maybe we may agree with a lot of what he believes in, but this is like his 11th consecutive term. So. And although Hamilton came from, he was an immigrant seeking a better life for himself, he was anti-immigrant, and he worked hard to pass the Naturalization Act of 1798, which took the vote away from recent immigrants. He helped to pass the Alien Act, which gave the president, the federal government, the power to deport anyone that they felt was a danger to the United States. And then the Sedition Act, which really was just aimed at the opposition. It was meant to be no dissent against the government of Adams and the work of Hamilton. And, these are all kind of Trumpian in spirit, and I hate to say the T word in that, but like really, I mean, restricting the right to vote and restricting dissent is very much a part of the today. So, and people talk about him authoring the Federalist Papers as some a defense of the Constitution. Some people wonder if there really was that advocacy needed at the beginning. But it's become this way for the Supreme Court currently to call back to the Founding Fathers and say, we wrote the Federalist Papers and it